Hey guys, my name's Jake. It's a new year, got a new background. Might as well try to learn something new. So I try to stay pretty in touch with art Instagram. That's where I share a lot of my pieces. So I'm obviously looking to see what else is out there. And over the past 6 to 8 months or so, I've seen one person absolutely blow up. And frankly, it's really easy to see why. His name is Sam Yang, better known as Sam Does Arts on Instagram, YouTube, all of that. And he just has this really incredible, appealing, beautiful style that I really just enjoy looking at. And one of the things that he does really well throughout all of his pieces is to capture light and to use light as a key element in his compositions. He does a ton of pieces focusing on kind of that golden hour lighting, bright sunlight, even the spotlight effect. And he just seems to have such a powerful control over light in his compositions that really elevates each one of his artworks to something that I think is really special. So seeing that, I felt really inspired. That is always something that's been a little weak for me. So that's what I want to do today. I want to take a look at some of Sam's work, do some practice to try to understand what he's doing and how he's manipulating the colors in his compositions to create that sense of lighting that he does so well, and then create my own piece at the end of it. I'm really excited about this. He's an artist that I've admired for a little bit now, so I'm really just excited to see what I can create and use that inspiration that he provided to hopefully make something pretty cool. Let's get it. So to get started, I pulled a couple pieces of Sam's where I feel that he uses light really effectively just to get a closer look at. Obviously, one of the most important things when situating your character in a strong lighting environment is to have a really solid understanding of the form of the character that you're lighting, and clearly Sam does. But what I want to look at a little bit more closely here is how he situates the character in the lighting environment and how that changes based off lighting temperature and what's being affected. He captures different lighting temperatures really well, and I think it just adds a nice warmth and overall sense of realism to the piece. I spent a lot of time looking at each one of these pictures individually and trying to break them down, but to avoid turning this video into a 25-minute analysis of some good artwork, let's just take a look at 3 things real quick. The first thing I want to look at is the forearm in this picture here. The lighting in this picture is pretty neutral, a little warm, but this forearm gives us a really nice example where we can understand the form. The arm's pretty simply just a cylinder, and we can see how the light and shadow interact on this form. One thing I noticed that as I drag the color selector across the arm here, you can see this transition from a really high value color, almost near white, where the arm is fully exposed to light, to a more heavily saturated, but also pretty high value color in the orange as you get towards the mid-tone of the arm, and then proceeding into a darker, more desaturated value in the shadows. This C shape on the color wheel is pretty evident throughout a couple different places in Sam's work. And this transition from dark to light with that saturation variation that forms that C shape makes a lot of sense. When you think about traditionally light being painted, you think about a bright white spot surrounded by a really high saturation color that hints at the color of the light. Think if you've ever seen somebody try to paint neon, it's the same effect. Similarly, as we look at this second picture where the light is much warmer, we can see this same pattern on the section of the arm that transitions from light to shadow. That C shape is slightly modified, shifted towards a more saturated red overall, but generally that same shape is there. Of course, it's important to note that the hue is shifting throughout this as well. That adds a little bit of dynamicism and realism to the overall piece. But the thing that really struck me when looking at this were those highly saturated midtones. Of course, the underlying color is also going to play a big factor. You can see that when looking at the cat in this piece, and notice how much more red the forehead of the cat is compared to the shoulder in the same piece. That's a pretty intuitive thing that the base color of the piece is going to play a factor, but it's also important to point out. The last thing that I want to look at is this third piece where we have, again, a warmer lighting situation, but the character's in a much cooler environment. And one thing that really struck me with this when I was taking a look at some of the colors that were used is you can notice the shadow coming across her chest, how cool that feels. Well, taking a look at that color truly, you would see that it's actually a fairly warm color, but it's just surrounded by that really high value, highly saturated orange that makes it feel so much cooler in context. And I feel like this is just a really important thing to identify in order to capture that same realism. The color temperature feels the same between the shadow across her chest and the shadow on the lower half of her shirt, but the differences between those two colors are actually really drastic. It's definitely going to be important to understand how the overall environment affects the shadows and how the underlying tone is going to shift those colors as well. Now, before moving on to the final piece, I wanted to get a little practice with these concepts. So I set up a little template where I could try out some different light temperatures on different colors of spheres and see if I could make it look like it was sitting in a warm environment with warm light, in a cool environment with warm light, etc. So I have 4 different rows here: warm, 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 cool, cool, warm, and cool, cool, where the first word indicates the temperature of the light, and then the second indicates kind of the overall ambient light temperature of the room that it'd be sitting in. And that's going to affect the shadows a little bit more. So I started out with a gray and just kind of worked through these to try my hand at creating the lighting. Gray was a little weird to work with because the light is going to affect the color pretty dramatically since gray is such a neutral base. So I might have gone a little over the top here, but it was good practice for the first set. The next thing I wanted to try to do was try it on more of a skin tone color. So I have this kind of light tan that I use as a base, and then come through and try to repeat the same thing with warm and cool light. Now, the first thing I noticed, and probably the most important takeaway that I got from this, was when I was applying cool light or cool shadow to these warm colored spheres, the thing that made it look right was not to hue shift towards a cooler color, which I was originally thinking would be the case. It was actually just to desaturate the color a good bit. And what clicked in my head as I realized this was that essentially you're doing this light mixing where you're setting this like more orange colored sphere in a cooler environment, and it's getting some ambient blue light that's going to create a desaturated color. You're essentially mixing 2 complementary colors, which is going to muddle the overall effect and create much more of a gray rather than anything that's really truly blue, unless it was in just a really strong light, which wasn't the case here. This felt like a really good thing to learn right before trying my hand at a full piece. So with that knowledge under my belt, let's get into this final one. So the ultimate goal of this project was to challenge myself to convincingly situate a character into a lighting scenario. So I went and found 2 reference photos, one to give me the environment and then the other to give me the subject. I then put together a quick sketch to throw them both together and got to work. Started off just painting the background, and this goes pretty simply. It's straight up just trying to copy the reference photo as close as possible to try to get a background in place that I could use. Now, remember, the ultimate goal here is to learn how to paint this environment and the character in the environment. I don't want to rely on layer styles such as multiply or overlay to help me with those lights and shadows. That doesn't mean, however, that I can't use it to quickly add some raindrops to this window and save myself a good bit of time. After getting the background to a place that I felt pretty confident starting with, I decided that I needed to redo the sketch. Full disclosure, this was not without a failed attempt to try to go from a very rough sketch that I just wasn't happy with, the evidence of which is still in my layer tree, but just try to ignore that. Anyway, updated the sketch to give myself a better template to work from, and then got down to laying in some base colors. Overall, these base colors went down pretty smoothly. I tried to use my reference as a starting point and then just really paid attention to where my light sources would be, which primarily is going to be that warm glow of the candle and then some softer light coming in from the window. Most of her body was going to be in shadow, with the exception of a little light spilling over off the ledge. you have to excuse me, this next part jumps around a little bit as I try to get this face looking decent. It had been a little bit since I'd drawn digitally and just could not seem to get this right. And in hindsight, it was probably not the best idea to go and stare at Sam's artwork for that long and then go and try to draw a pretty girl myself. I think it turned out pretty well in the end, but it definitely took a lot of tinkering, so I'll have to apologize for jumping around as much as I did. Once I finally got the face to a good point, it was on to finish up the body and the clothes. A lot of this was in shadow, so there wasn't a ton of variation through this piece. I just had to pay attention to some highlights on the wrinkles in the clothing and the certain places where the light from the candle came over the edge onto her lap. In either case, this was much more subtle than the lighting on her face, but that's expected given the distance from the light and the fact that most of it's in shadow anyways. After getting the character laid in, it was time to just add those final details, touch up the background a little bit, add in the candle and the reflections in the window. I also brought in this tree element that was in the original background reference that I thought just added a nice bit of balance to the composition, which I think turned out nicely. And after a few more final touches, this thing is ready to go. Let's take a look at the final. Alright, so that will do it for this one. I'm pretty happy with how the final piece turned out. It was definitely one that took a lot more tinkering than I think I'm used to, but that's understandable. It's something new. It's going to take a little bit of practice and definitely a long way to go to get to where I want to be, but this is a good start. It was a lot of fun to study Sam's work and take a look at that. Definitely go check him out on Instagram and YouTube. Go like his stuff, subscribe to his stuff. Do the same to mine too, but you know, give him some credit. I'm really liking this idea for the channel to try to do a little inspired by series where I get to kind of check out artists that I admire and try to either emulate something that they're doing or media that they're using. I don't know. I think it would just be really cool and help my own growth. And so I'm kind of excited about that prospect. If you enjoyed this kind of video, be sure to like it. Let me know in the comments. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. I'm really looking forward to some stuff that I have coming up. Had a little bit of time off because of the holidays and moving and just getting settled, and I'm really excited to dive back in. But until then, I will see y'all next time.